The baby's cry broke through the silence before dawn, sharp and urgent, echoing against the cold stone walls of the small house. It wasn't the soft, restless sound Duong had grown used to over the past 5 months. This cry was different. It carried fear, pain, and something he could not name, something that made his heart tighten the moment he heard it. His eyes opened instantly. For a second, his body reacted like it still belonged to the military, alert, tense, ready for danger. But the battlefield was gone. There were no commands, no weapons, no enemies, only a small wooden bed and a baby. "Truc lam," he whispered, his voice still thick with sleep but already filled with worry. The crying didn't stop. It grew louder, more desperate, as if the tiny body could not contain whatever discomfort it was feeling. Duong pushed himself up immediately and reached for her. The room was dim, lit only by the faint blue light of early morning filtering through the cracks in the window. The air was cold enough that his breath felt heavy, but none of that mattered when he saw her face. Her cheeks were flushed red, her eyes squeezed tightly shut, her small hands clenched into fists as she cried with all her strength. Her body trembled slightly in his arms. Something was wrong. Hey, I'm here," he said softly, lifting her carefully, holding her close to his chest the way he had learned over time. His movements were gentle now, practiced, but inside he was already beginning to panic. At first, he tried the simplest thing. He checked her diaper. Dry. He touched her forehead. Not hot. He adjusted the blanket around her. Still crying. He frowned, his thoughts racing. "Are you hungry?" He didn't wait for an answer. He moved quickly to the small table, grabbing the kettle with one hand and pouring water with the other. The sound of metal clinking felt louder than usual in the quiet house. His hands, once steady under pressure, now trembled slightly. 5 months ago, he had never imagined himself in this position. He had known how to endure pain, how to survive harsh conditions, how to follow orders without hesitation. But nothing in those 2 years had prepared him for this, for the helplessness of watching someone so small suffer. "Just wait a little, just a little," he murmured, glancing back at the bed where the crying continued without pause. He mixed the milk quickly, testing the temperature on his wrist. It was warm enough. He returned to her side and gently lifted the bottle. "Here, drink this." For a brief moment, it seemed like she might respond. Her lips touched the bottle. Then suddenly, she turned her head away and cried even louder. Duong froze. His heart dropped instantly. No, don't do that," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "You need to drink." He tried again, more carefully this time, adjusting the angle, supporting her head the way he had done so many times before. But she refused. Her cries became more intense, her breathing uneven, her tiny body stiffening in his arms. A cold wave of fear rushed through him. This wasn't normal. Something was wrong. "Truc lam, what's wrong?" he whispered, his voice no longer calm. He held her closer, rocking gently back and forth, trying to soothe her, but nothing worked. The sound of her crying filled every corner of the house, pressing into him, suffocating him. And then, without warning, a memory surfaced. Himself, at 12 years old, standing alone in front of a hospital room, watching helplessly as his parents slipped away one after the other, taken by illness he couldn't understand and couldn't stop. The same helplessness, the same fear. "No," he muttered, shaking his head, as if trying to push the memory away. "Not again." His breathing became heavier. "What if she's sick?" The thought hit him hard, sending his mind into chaos. He looked down at the baby in his arms, her face still red, her cries still relentless. He couldn't stay here. He couldn't wait. If something happened because he hesitated, he would never forgive himself. Without another second of doubt, he stood up. He grabbed a thicker cloth, wrapping her tightly, securing her small body against his chest. His move, the cold, the village, just a nurse looked up, startled by the sudden noise. "What happened?" she asked, standing up quickly. "I don't know," he said, his breathing uneven, his chest rising and falling rapidly. "She won't stop crying. She won't drink. Something's wrong." The nurse's expression changed immediately. "Bring her here." Duong stepped forward, carefully handing over the baby. And in that moment, for the first time since he woke up, his arms were empty. The absence hit him harder than he expected. He stood there, his hands still slightly raised, as if unsure what to do without her weight in them. The nurse moved quickly, checking the baby's breathing, her temperature, her reactions. Duong watched every movement, his entire body tense. "Is she okay?" he asked, his voice low but urgent. The nurse didn't answer immediately. "Wait outside," she said firmly. The words felt like a command. Duong stepped back slowly. The door closed, and suddenly, everything went quiet. Too quiet. He stood in the hallway, staring at the closed door, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't control. What if it was serious? What if he had missed something? What if he had waited too long? He clenched his fists tightly, his nails digging into his palms. "If something happens to her," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "I won't forgive myself." He leaned his head back against the wall, closing his eyes for a moment. 5 months ago, she had been a stranger, a fragile life he had chosen to save. But now, she was everything. The reason he woke up every morning, the reason he kept going, the reason his empty house no longer felt empty. Time passed slowly, painfully, each second stretching longer than the last. Then, the sound of the door handle turning. Duong's eyes opened immediately. His heart stopped. The door began to open, and whatever came next would change everything. The door opened slowly. Trieu Duong's heart pounded so hard it felt like it might break through his chest. For a brief second, he couldn't move. He couldn't even breathe. All the fear he had been holding back now surged to the surface, threatening to overwhelm him. The nurse stepped out, her face calmer than before. "She's okay." The words were simple, but to Duong, they felt like the entire world had just been lifted off his shoulders. He staggered forward slightly. "Really? She's okay?" The nurse nodded. "Yes, she has a bit of colic and some discomfort. Also, she's reached the stage where she needs her vaccinations. That's why she's been more sensitive and irritable." Duong blinked, still trying to process everything. "So it's not serious?" "No," the nurse replied gently, "but you brought her in at the right time. If you had waited longer, it could have become worse." Duong closed his eyes for a brief moment, exhaling deeply. His legs felt weak, like all the strength had drained out of him at once. "Can I see her?" he asked. The nurse stepped aside. "She's inside." When Duong walked into the room, everything felt quieter. Truc lay on the small examination bed. Her crying had softened into occasional whimpers. Her tiny chest rose and fell unevenly, her face still slightly flushed from exhaustion. Duong approached slowly. "Hey, I'm here," he whispered. The moment his fingers touched her hand, she moved slightly, as if recognizing him. That small reaction was enough to make his throat tighten again. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "I didn't know what to do." He gently lifted her into his arms, holding her close, resting her head against his chest. This time her crying didn't grow louder. It faded, slowly, as if his presence alone was enough to calm her. "She needs to be vaccinated today," the nurse said from behind him. "It's important." Duong stiffened slightly. "Today? Yes. It will help protect her. But she will cry. It's normal." Duong looked down at Truc, her small face, her fragile body. The thought of her being hurt, even for a moment, made something inside him twist painfully. "Will it hurt a lot?" he asked quietly. The nurse didn't lie. "She will feel pain, but it will pass quickly." Duong swallowed hard. Pain. He knew pain. He had endured it countless times. But this was different. Because this time, he wouldn't be the one feeling it. "Okay," he said finally, his voice low but steady. "Do it." The room felt colder. The nurse prepared the injection carefully, her movements precise and practiced. The metallic sound of the tray, the faint smell of antiseptic, it all made Duong's nerves tighten. He sat down on the chair, holding Truc securely. "Stay still," the nurse instructed. Duong nodded. But inside, everything was shaking. He adjusted his grip, one hand supporting her head, the other holding her tiny arm. "It's okay. It's okay," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was comforting her or himself. The needle came closer. For a split second, everything slowed down. Duong's eyes locked onto it. His breath caught. "No," a small voice inside him whispered. Then, the needle pierced her skin. The cry exploded into the room, louder than anything before, raw, sharp, filled with pain. Duong flinched instinctively. His grip tightened. His heart clenched so violently it felt unbearable. I'm sorry, he whispered, his voice breaking. He turned his face slightly away, unable to fully watch, but he didn't let go, not even for a second. Her tiny fingers curled tightly, grasping at nothing, her whole body shaking as she cried. Each second felt like forever. Each cry felt like a blade cutting into him. He had faced storms, hunger, exhaustion, but nothing had ever made him feel this powerless. I'm here. Don't be scared," he kept repeating, his voice trembling. And then, it was over. The nurse stepped back. "It's done." But Truc was still crying. Her cries had turned into sobs now, softer but still filled with distress. Duong immediately pulled her closer, pressing her against his chest. "Shh. It's okay. It's over. You did so well," he whispered, rocking gently. His hand moved slowly along her back, trying to soothe her. "I'm sorry. I had to do it, so you can be safe." His voice was filled with guilt, with pain, because even though he knew it was necessary, it didn't make it easier. "If you're watching this right now," he murmured softly, his eyes fixed on the baby in his arms. "Have you ever felt pain? Not because you were hurt, but because someone you love was?" He paused. His throat tightened. "Because that hurts even more." Slowly, her crying began to fade. Her breathing steadied, her small hands relaxed, and finally, she leaned into him, trusting him completely, as if nothing in the world could harm her as long as he was there. Duong closed his eyes, holding her tighter, not out of fear anymore, but out of something deeper, a promise. After a while, the nurse handed him some instructions. "Keep her warm, watch for fever, feed her regularly, and bring her back for the next schedule." Duong nodded, listening carefully, memorizing every word. "I will." His voice was different now, more certain, more grounded. When he stepped out of the clinic, the sun had already risen higher. The village was alive again, but everything felt different. He looked down at Truc, now sleeping quietly in his arms, her face peaceful, as if nothing had happened. A faint smile appeared on his lips. "You're stronger than I thought," he whispered. Then he looked ahead, toward the path leading back home, toward the small garden waiting for him, toward the life he had started building. "I don't have much," he said quietly, "but I'll give you everything I can." He adjusted the cloth, securing her gently against his chest. "And I'll learn, no matter how hard it is." As he walked back along the narrow path, the sunlight filtered through the trees, casting warm shadows on the ground. Each step felt steadier, certain than before, because now, he wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living, for her, and somewhere deep inside him, a new strength had begun to grow. Not the strength of a soldier, but the strength of someone who chooses to stay, to protect, to love, no matter what it takes. That evening, the mountain air felt softer than usual. The wind no longer howled through the cracks of the stone house. Instead, it moved gently, carrying the scent of fresh soil from the small garden in front of Duong's home. The same garden he had been slowly building, one handful of earth at a time, with Truc always close by. She was sleeping now, peacefully, as if the pain from earlier had already faded into something distant and unimportant. Duong sat quietly on the wooden step outside his house, holding her in his arms. The fading sunlight painted everything in warm gold, the trees, the soil, the worn-out walls that had witnessed his loneliness for so many years. But tonight, The house didn't feel empty. Not anymore. He looked down at her. Her tiny chest rose and fell steadily, her fingers slightly curled as they rested against his shirt. There was something about that simple, quiet moment that made his chest tighten, not with fear this time, but with something deeper. Gratitude. "You were so brave today," he whispered. His voice was soft, almost carried away by the wind. "I think I was more scared than you." A faint smile appeared on his lips. For someone who had endured the harshness of military life, who had learned to face danger without hesitation, he had never imagined that a small needle and a baby's cry could shake him so completely. But maybe that was the difference. Before, he had only fought for survival. He was living for someone else. He adjusted the cloth around her gently and leaned back against the wooden pillar. The sky above was slowly turning orange, then red, then deep purple. Time passed quietly, but his thoughts did not. "What if one day I'm not enough?" he murmured. The question slipped out before he could stop it. It lingered in the air, heavy and real. He had no stable income, no family to rely on, no experience raising a child, just a small house and his own 2 hands. Was that really enough to give her a future? He looked toward the garden. The newly planted rows of vegetables were still small, fragile, barely growing. Just like her. Just like him. Everything in his life felt unfinished, uncertain, but still growing. Slowly. "If you've ever felt like you're not enough," he said quietly, as if speaking to someone far away, "then maybe we're not so different." He paused. His eyes softened. "Because I feel that way too." At that moment, Truc stirred slightly in his arms. Her tiny hand moved, searching, and without thinking, she grabbed his finger, firm, instinctive, trusting. Duong froze. Then slowly, his expression changed. The doubt in his eyes faded, replaced by something stronger. She didn't know about his fears. She didn't know about his past. She didn't care about what he didn't have. All she knew was that he was there, and that was enough. Duong let out a slow breath, then gently tightened his hold around her. "Maybe I don't have everything," he said, "but I won't leave." His voice was quiet, but certain. "I'll learn. I'll try. I'll build whatever I need to build. For you." The sun disappeared behind the mountains. Darkness slowly covered the valley, but the small house did not feel cold anymore. Inside, a weak light flickered on. Outside, a young man sat still, holding a child who had changed his life completely. No promises of an easy future, no guarantee of what was coming next, only a choice to stay, to protect, to love. "If this story made you feel something, even just a little," Duong's voice echoed softly in the quiet night, "please stay, subscribe, and leave a comment." He looked down at Truc one last time, because sometimes the smallest life can give us the biggest reason to keep going. And somewhere in that quiet mountain village, a broken past did not end a life. It began one, a life that was still uncertain, still unfinished, but finally, full of hope.